The car came to a stop outside the diner so fast that the tires screamed against the wet street. Grace Bennett froze behind the counter, a coffee pot still in her hand, as four men stepped out into the rain like they owned every inch of the sidewalk. She had worked at this diner for 3 years. She had seen drunks, thieves, and angry customers. She had never seen anything like this. The door opened with a bell that suddenly sounded too loud. The owner of the diner, an old man named Walter, stood behind the register with his hands shaking. He knew exactly who these men worked for, and so did every business owner on this street. They called him Dominic Marchetti, though nobody said his name above a whisper. Dominic did not raise his voice. He did not have to. He walked in last, calm and unhurried, wearing a dark coat that looked far too expensive for a rainy Tuesday night. His eyes moved across the diner slowly, taking in every table, every face, until they landed on Walter. "You were told last week," Dominic said quietly. "I do not like repeating myself." Walter's mouth opened, but no words came out. His hands gripped the edge of the counter. Grace watched him, and something in her chest twisted painfully. Walter had given her a job when nobody else would. He had let her pay off her father's old debts a little at a time, without ever making her feel small for it. She was not going to stand there and watch him get frightened into silence. She set the coffee pot down harder than she meant to. "He doesn't have the money because business has been slow," Grace said, stepping out from behind the counter. "Everyone's rent went up this year. You would know that if you actually lived in this neighborhood instead of just owning it." The room went completely still. One of the men beside Dominic laughed under his breath, as if he could not believe what he had just heard. Dominic did not laugh. He turned his head toward Grace with a slow, deliberate motion, studying her the way a person studies something unexpected. Nobody spoke to him like that. Nobody dared. "And who are you?" he asked, his voice low and even. "Someone who works here," Grace said. "Someone who watches him count every dollar twice before he pays anyone. He is not hiding money from you. There isn't any to hide." One of Dominic's men shifted forward, ready to put her back in her place, but Dominic lifted 2 fingers without even looking at him, and the man stopped instantly. Grace's heart pounded so hard she was sure everyone could hear it, but she kept her chin up. She was terrified. She simply refused to let it show. Dominic studied her for a long moment. Most people who spoke to him with that kind of nerve did so out of desperation, saying whatever they could to save themselves. This woman was not defending herself. She did not even look afraid for her own safety. She was defending an old man behind a counter who was not even her family. "Interesting," Dominic finally said, so quietly that only she seemed to hear it. He turned back to Walter. 2 weeks, he said. "Not because I believe her, because I am curious what happens next." He walked out without another word, his men following behind him like shadows. The bell above the door rang again, and then the diner was silent, except for the sound of the rain and Walter's unsteady breathing. Grace let out the breath she had been holding, her hands trembling now that the danger had passed. Walter looked at her like she had lost her mind. "Do you know who that was?" he whispered. "I know," Grace said, though her voice shook slightly. "I just couldn't let him scare you like that." Walter shook his head slowly, half in disbelief and half in something like gratitude. "Nobody talks to Dominic Marchetti that way, Grace. Nobody." Grace did not answer. She was still staring at the door, replaying the moment in her mind, trying to understand why her hands would not stop shaking even now that he was gone. Outside, inside the dark car pulling away from the curb, Dominic sat in silence while the city lights slid across the window. One of his men, a broad-shouldered man named Marcus who had worked beside him for over 10 years, glanced at him carefully. "You want me to look into her?" Marcus asked. Dominic did not answer right away. He kept watching the diner shrink behind them through the rear window, the warm yellow light glowing against the wet street. "Find out everything," Dominic said finally. "Her name, her family, where she comes from, everything." Marcus raised an eyebrow but said nothing more. In all his years working for Dominic, he had never once heard him ask about someone this way. Threats, debts, rivals, deals gone wrong. Those were the things Dominic asked about. Never a waitress from a rundown diner who had the nerve to speak to him like an equal. That night, Grace could not sleep. She lay in her small apartment above a laundromat, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain tapping against the window. She kept telling herself it was nothing, that a man like that would forget about a diner and an ordinary waitress by morning. Men like him had far bigger things to worry about than someone who spoke out of turn once. She was wrong. 2 days later, a black car parked outside the diner again, but this time only one man stepped out. He was young, polite, and carried a folder under his arm. He introduced himself simply as someone representing new ownership, interested in leasing the building. Walter, confused and nervous, tried to explain that the diner already belonged to him. Not the building, the young man said gently, just the land beneath it. The new owner would like to discuss new terms with you directly. Grace watched from behind the counter, her stomach twisting with unease. She recognized something in the calm, careful way the man spoke. It reminded her too much of the night in the rain. A week passed, and then another black car arrived, and this time it was Dominic himself who stepped out, without his usual crowd of men trailing behind him. He walked in alone, took a seat at the counter as though he were any regular customer, and ordered a cup of coffee like it was the most normal thing in the world. Grace's hands trembled slightly as she poured it, though she tried hard not to let it show. He watched her carefully, his expression unreadable, until she finally set the cup down in front of him. "Is there something you actually need?" Grace asked, keeping her tone steady. "Or are you just here to make Walter more nervous than he already is?" A faint, almost surprised smile crossed Dominic's face, gone as quickly as it appeared. "I told him 2 weeks," he said. "I am simply checking on my investment. He doesn't have your money yet." "I know," Dominic said. "I am not here for the money." Grace stared at him, confused and cautious. "Then why are you here?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow sip of his coffee, studying her over the rim of the cup, as though trying to solve some puzzle that made no sense to him. In his world, people either feared him or tried to use him. She did neither. She simply looked at him like he was a man who had walked into her diner and needed to be careful with his manners, nothing more. "You are not what I expected," he said finally. "You don't know anything about me," Grace replied. "Not yet," Dominic said quietly, setting down his cup, "but I intend to." He left a bill on the counter, far larger than the coffee could possibly cost, and walked out without waiting for change, leaving Grace standing there, with her heart pounding in a way she did not fully understand. She told herself it was fear. Somewhere underneath that fear, though, was a flicker of something else entirely, something she was not ready to name. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, but the clouds still hung heavy and dark over the city, as if warning that this was only the beginning of a storm neither of them could see coming. 3 days after Dominic left the diner with his coffee untouched, Grace noticed a man sitting in the corner booth who had not been there before. He came in every morning, ordered black coffee, and read a newspaper he never seemed to actually finish. He never spoke to her beyond a polite thank you. Still, something about the way his eyes tracked the door every time it opened told her he was not simply a regular customer looking for a quiet place to read. She mentioned it to Walter one afternoon, while wiping down the counter. "That man in the corner," she said quietly. "He's been here every day this week." Walter glanced over, then lowered his voice. "Marcus. He works for Marchetti." Grace's stomach dropped. "Why is he watching us?" "He's not watching us," Walter said, folding a dish towel with hands that were not quite steady. "I think he's watching you." Cheese. Grace wanted to dismiss it as nonsense, but over the following days, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Marcus was not the only new face. A delivery driver who had never worked their street before started dropping off supplies twice a week, always finding some reason to linger near the counter. A woman who claimed to be scouting locations for a documentary asked Grace strange, personal questions about her life, her family, and how long she had lived in the city. Grace answered carefully, giving away as little as possible, though she suspected the answers had already been collected somewhere else entirely. She confronted Marcus directly on a quiet Thursday morning, setting his coffee down harder than necessary. "You can tell your boss," she said, "that I don't like being studied like a science project." Marcus looked up from his newspaper, unbothered by her tone. "I don't know what you mean." "You know exactly what I mean." He folded the newspaper slowly and set it aside. "Dominic Marchetti does not do anything without a reason," he said. "If he is interested in you, it is because something about you does not fit the pattern he expects. That is rare. He does not let it go easily once it happens." "That's not comforting," Grace said. "That's terrifying." "It should be," Marcus said simply. and returned to his coffee as though the conversation had ended. That evening, Grace walked home through streets that suddenly felt different, as though every shadow held eyes she could not see. She told herself she was imagining things, that fear was twisting her thoughts into something dramatic. Still, she found herself glancing over her shoulder more than once, and when she finally reached her apartment, she locked the door and checked it twice. The following week, Dominic returned to the diner again, this time in the middle of the lunch rush. He waited patiently at the counter until Grace had a free moment, watching her work with the same quiet intensity he seemed to bring to everything. "You've been sending people to watch me," Grace said the moment she reached him, keeping her voice low so the other customers would not hear. "I like to understand the people who interest me," Dominic said. "That's not understanding. That's control." Something flickered across his face, something that looked almost like surprise. Nobody spoke to him about control. People either accepted the way his world worked, or they avoided him entirely. She did neither. She challenged him, openly and without hesitation, in a way that should have made him angry. Instead, it made him lean forward slightly, more curious than before. "You're right," he admitted. "It is control. I have spent my whole life needing to understand everything around me before it can hurt me. It is not a habit I know how to turn off." Grace blinked, caught off guard by the honesty in his answer. She had expected excuses, or worse, threats disguised as charm. She had not expected something close to vulnerability. "Why would understanding me matter to someone like you?" she asked. Dominic considered the question carefully before answering. "Because in my world, everyone wants something from me. Money, protection, favors, information. You wanted nothing. You stood in front of me and defended a man who could not defend himself, without asking for anything in return. I have not seen that in a very long time." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the diner faded into the background, forks against plates, quiet conversations, the hiss of the coffee machine, none of it seeming to matter as much as the space between them. "That doesn't mean I want to be part of your world," Grace finally said. "I know," Dominic replied, "but it is already too late for that." He was right, though neither of them fully understood how right he was until 3 nights later. Grace was closing the diner alone, since Walter had gone home early with a cold, when she noticed a car parked across the street that had not been there when her shift began. She told herself it was nothing, locked the front door, and began walking toward the bus stop 2 blocks away. The streets were quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that made every footstep behind her sound too loud. She heard the car before she saw it, tires moving slowly along the curb beside her. When she turned, 2 men she did not recognize stepped out onto the sidewalk, their expressions cold and unfamiliar. Grace's heart slammed against her ribs as she quickened her pace, but one of the men called out to her, his voice carrying a warning she did not need translated. "Tell your boss," he said, "that Marchetti does not scare us anymore. Tell him we know exactly where he likes to keep his new distraction." Before Grace could fully process what was happening, headlights swept across the street, and a familiar black car pulled up so fast it nearly clipped the curb. Marcus was out of the driver's seat before it had even fully stopped, moving toward her with a speed that startled her. The 2 strangers, seeing him, exchanged a glance and quickly retreated to their own car, disappearing down the street without another word. "Are you hurt?" Marcus asked, scanning her carefully. Grace shook her head, though her whole body was trembling. "Who were they?" "Rivals," Marcus said grimly. "People who think Dominic has gotten distracted lately. People who think that distraction makes him weak." He walked her to the car without waiting for permission, and Grace, too shaken to argue, allowed herself to be guided into the back seat. The drive was silent except for the low hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of a radio Marcus kept glancing at nervously. They arrived not at her apartment, but at a large, quiet house on the edge of the city, surrounded by high walls and a gate that opened automatically as the car approached. Grace stared out the window, her mind spinning, unsure whether she was being protected or trapped. Dominic was waiting at the door when the car pulled in, his expression unreadable in the dim porch light. The moment Grace stepped out, his eyes swept over her quickly, checking for any sign of harm, before finally settling on her face. "You should not have been walking alone," he said, his voice tight with something that sounded almost like anger, though Grace suspected it was directed at himself rather than her. "I didn't know I needed protection," Grace said. her voice shaking despite her effort to sound steady. Not until you decided to make me part of whatever this is. Dominic's jaw tightened. You are right to be angry with me. I'm not just angry, Grace said. I'm terrified. Do you understand that? Those men knew who I was. They knew where to find me, because of you. I know, Dominic said quietly, and for the first time since she had met him, his voice carried something close to regret. I did not intend for my world to reach you this way. But it has, Grace said. So what happens now? Dominic studied her for a long moment, the porch light casting shadows across his face, making him look older and more tired than she had ever seen him. Now, he said, you stay somewhere safe, until I am certain those men understand exactly how badly they miscalculated. And if I refuse? Then I will still make certain you are safe, Dominic said, whether you agree to it or not. Grace wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she could take care of herself, but the memory of those two men on the empty street, calling her Dominic's distraction, made the words die in her throat. She was already involved, whether she liked it or not. Pretending otherwise would only put her in more danger. She followed him inside without another word, and the heavy door closed behind them with a quiet, final sound that seemed to echo far longer than it should have. Inside, the house was quiet, elegant, and strangely empty, as though it had never truly been lived in. Dominic led her to a room on the second floor, simply furnished but comfortable, and told her she was free to use anything she needed. He lingered in the doorway a moment longer than necessary, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. I am sorry, he said finally. For all of it. Grace looked at him carefully, searching for the coldness she had expected from a man with his reputation. She found something else instead, something tired and human, beneath the calm exterior he wore like armor. I believe you, she said quietly. That doesn't mean I'm not still afraid. You should be, Dominic admitted. I am not a safe man to be near, Grace. I never have been. Then why does some part of me feel safer with you than I did on that street tonight? Dominic had no answer for that. He simply held her gaze for a long moment, before finally stepping back and closing the door softly behind him, leaving Grace alone with her racing thoughts, and a growing, uncomfortable realization that the line between fear and something far more dangerous had already begun to blur. Grace woke the next morning in an unfamiliar bed, sunlight cutting through unfamiliar curtains, and for a moment she forgot where she was. Then the memory of the night before returned all at once. The two strangers on the empty street, the fear in her chest, the strange, quiet house she now found herself inside. She sat up slowly, listening to the silence around her, unsure what she was supposed to do next. A soft knock came at the door before she could decide. A woman named Olivia, who introduced herself as part of the household staff, brought in a tray of breakfast and a change of clothes that fit almost perfectly, as though someone had studied her size without her ever noticing. Grace thanked her quietly, though the gesture unsettled her more than it comforted her. Every detail of this world seemed designed to remind her how closely she was being watched. Downstairs, she found Dominic in a large kitchen, sleeves rolled up, making coffee himself rather than asking someone else to do it for him. He looked up when she entered, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. You didn't have to do that yourself, Grace said, nodding toward the coffee. I like doing it myself, Dominic said. It is one of the few quiet moments I get in a day that is otherwise never quiet. Grace sat across from him at the counter, accepting the cup he offered. For a while, neither of them spoke, the silence oddly comfortable despite everything that had happened the night before. I want to go home, Grace finally said. I know, Dominic replied. It is not safe yet. Define not safe. Dominic set his cup down carefully. The men who approached you last night belong to a family that has been trying to push into territory that has always belonged to mine. They believe that because I have shown interest in you, I have become careless. They believe hurting you would weaken me more than hurting me directly. Grace felt a chill run through her despite the warmth of the kitchen. So this is about proving a point. To them, yes, Dominic said. To me, it has stopped being about points a long time ago. What does that mean? Dominic looked at her for a long moment, as though weighing how honest he was willing to be. It means I would rather lose everything I have built than lose you to something that happened because of me. The words settled heavily in the room, and Grace found herself unable to look away from him, caught somewhere between fear and something warmer, that she still refused to name. She had grown up hearing stories about men like Dominic, men who ruled through fear and left destruction behind them without a second thought. Nothing about the man sitting across from her matched those stories, not entirely, and that unsettled her more than any threat could have. Over the following days, Grace remained at the house, though never quite as a prisoner, and never quite as a guest either. She learned the rhythms of Dominic's world slowly, watching men come and go with quiet urgency, overhearing fragments of conversations about territory, loyalty, and betrayal that she was clearly not meant to fully understand. She learned that Marcus had been with Dominic since they were both young men trying to survive a childhood that had given neither of them many choices. She learned that Dominic rarely slept more than a few hours a night, and that when he did sleep, his expression softened in a way it never did while awake. One evening, she found him standing alone on the balcony overlooking the quiet grounds, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand, his shoulders carrying a tension that seemed permanent. She joined him without asking permission, leaning against the railing beside him. "You don't have to pretend you're fine," Grace said quietly. Dominic glanced at her, surprised. "I don't pretend often." "You do," Grace said. "Every time someone mentions your father." His jaw tightened, and for a moment Grace worried she had crossed a line she should not have. Then, slowly, his shoulders lowered, as though something inside him had finally given way. "My father built this life," Dominic said. "He believed fear was the only language people truly respected. He taught me the same thing before I was old enough to understand what it meant. By the time I was old enough to disagree with him, disagreeing was no longer an option." "What happened to him?" "He trusted the wrong man," Dominic said simply. "It cost him everything, including his life. I was 17 when I took his place, surrounded by men twice my age who expected me to fail within a year." "You didn't fail." "No," Dominic said. "I became exactly what he raised me to be. Careful. Controlled. Alone." Grace studied his profile in the moonlight, the sharp lines of his face softened slightly by exhaustion and honesty. "You don't sound proud of that." "I'm not," Dominic admitted. "For a long time, I told myself pride did not matter as long as I survived. Then you walked into that diner and defended an old man who meant nothing to your own survival, and I realized I could not remember the last time I had done something simply because it was right, rather than because it was necessary." Grace's chest tightened at the rawness in his voice. She had expected many things from this man: danger, arrogance, cold calculation. She had not expected this quiet, aching honesty that seemed to cost him more than any threat he had ever made. "That doesn't erase what you do," Grace said carefully. "The fear people feel around you is real. I've seen it." "I know," Dominic said. "I have never asked you to ignore that." "Then what are you asking?" Dominic turned to face her fully, his expression open in a way she had never seen before. "I am not asking anything," he said. "I am simply telling you the truth, because you are the only person who has ever asked for it." The moment stretched between them, charged and fragile, until Grace finally looked away, overwhelmed by the weight of everything unfolding between them. She was not ready to examine what she felt standing beside him on that balcony, not when so much danger still surrounded them both. The fragile peace did not last long. 2 nights later, Marcus burst into the house with news that shattered whatever calm had settled over the household. A shipment belonging to Dominic's organization had been intercepted, and one of his most trusted men had been seriously hurt in the process. The message left behind was clear enough without needing translation. The rival family was done waiting. Grace watched from the top of the stairs as the house transformed into something colder and more urgent, men moving with sharp, controlled purpose, voices low and clipped. Dominic stood at the center of it all, his calm exterior fully restored, though Grace could see the tension coiled tightly beneath it. Later that night, once the house had quieted again, Grace found him alone in his study, staring at a map spread across his desk, markers scattered across it like pieces in a game she did not understand. "You're going to do something dangerous," she said quietly from the doorway. Dominic did not look up. "I am going to protect what is mine." "Is that what I am to you? Something that belongs to you?" His head lifted at that, his expression sharpening. "That is not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" Dominic set down the marker in his hand and finally met her eyes fully. I meant that I will not let anyone take away the one thing in my life that has ever felt like it was truly mine to protect, rather than something I was simply born responsible for. Grace's breath caught at the intensity in his voice. She wanted to be angry, wanted to remind him that she was not a possession to be fought over, yet the raw honesty in his words made it impossible to hold on to that anger fully. "I'm scared, Dominic," she admitted quietly. "Not just of them, of this, of how much I've started to feel safe with you, when everything about you should make me feel the opposite." Dominic crossed the room slowly, stopping close enough that she could see the exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "I am scared too," he admitted. "I have spent my whole life making certain nothing could ever be used against me. You have undone that in a matter of weeks." "That sounds like a weakness to you," Grace said softly. "It should," Dominic said. "Somehow it does not feel like one." For a long moment, neither of them moved, the weight of everything unspoken hanging heavily between them. Then Grace stepped back first, shaking her head slowly, torn between the pull she felt toward him and the fear of everything that pull might cost her. "I can't do this," she whispered. "Not like this, not surrounded by danger I never asked to be part of." Dominic's expression did not change, though something behind his eyes dimmed slightly. "Then I will not stop you from leaving," he said quietly. "But I will not stop protecting you either, whether you are near me or not." Grace nodded, her throat tight with emotions she could not fully sort through. The next morning, despite Marcus's clear disapproval, she insisted on returning to her apartment, needing distance to think clearly, needing space from a world that threatened to consume her entirely if she let it. Dominic did not try to stop her. He simply watched from the doorway as the car pulled away, his expression carefully guarded once again, though something in the way his hands clenched at his sides told a different story entirely, one Grace could not see, but one that would soon prove impossible to ignore. 2 weeks passed, and Grace tried to convince herself that returning to her old life would be enough to settle the storm inside her. She went back to the diner, back to her small apartment above the laundromat, back to the same routines that had once felt so familiar. Nothing felt the same anymore. Walter noticed the change in her almost immediately, the way she flinched at every car that slowed near the diner, the way her eyes drifted toward the door more often than they used to. She told herself the fear would fade with time. Instead, it grew heavier, especially once she noticed the same unfamiliar faces from before beginning to reappear around her neighborhood, watching from a careful distance. She understood now that Dominic had kept his word. He had not stopped protecting her, even after she walked away from his house and everything it represented. Meanwhile, across the city, Dominic's world had grown darker and more dangerous with every passing day. Without Grace nearby, Marcus noticed a change in him that worried even the men who had known him longest. He became sharper, colder, less patient with mistakes that once would have earned only a quiet correction. He worked through the nights instead of sleeping, driven by something Marcus suspected had less to do with business and more to do with the silence Grace had left behind in that quiet house. The rival family, led by a calculating man named Adam Whitfield, sensed the shift immediately and moved to take advantage of it. Whitfield had spent years trying to expand his influence into territory that had always belonged to the Marchetti family, and Dominic's apparent distraction gave him the opening he had been waiting for. Rather than risk a direct confrontation, Whitfield chose a path far more dangerous, one designed to strike at the one weakness he believed he had finally found. Grace was closing the diner alone again one evening, later than usual after a delivery had run behind schedule, when a car she did not recognize pulled up directly outside instead of simply passing by. Before she could react, 2 men stepped out and moved toward her with a speed that left no room for escape. She fought as best she could, but there were 2 of them and only one of her, and within moments she was forced into the back seat of the waiting car, the door slamming shut behind her, before anyone on the street even fully understood what had happened. Walter, watching from the diner window in horror, immediately called the one number Grace had left with him weeks earlier, insisting he use it only in case of an emergency. Marcus answered before the second ring finished, and within minutes, the entire Marchetti household had been thrown into controlled, urgent motion. Dominic received the news while reviewing reports in his study, and for the first time in longer than Marcus could remember, he watched genuine fear cross his employer's face before it hardened instantly into something far more dangerous. "Where?" Dominic said, his voice deadly calm in a way that unsettled even the men who had worked beside him for years. "We don't know yet," Marcus admitted, "but it has Whitfield's signature all over it." Dominic was already moving toward the door, pulling on his coat with sharp, controlled movements. "Then we start with every property he owns that isn't public record. Now." The following hours stretched into a tense, desperate search across the city. Dominic's men fanning out to check warehouses, private buildings, and locations Whitfield had used before to conduct business away from prying eyes. Dominic himself refused to remain behind, insisting on joining the search despite Marcus's repeated warnings that walking directly into danger was exactly what Whitfield wanted him to do. "I don't care what he wants," Dominic said sharply, cutting off any further argument. "I care what happens to her." Grace, meanwhile, sat in a dimly lit room somewhere on the outskirts of the city, her wrists bound loosely enough to remind her of her situation without causing unnecessary harm. Whitfield wanted her intact when Dominic arrived. He wanted Dominic to see exactly what carelessness could cost him. Whitfield himself entered the room eventually, studying Grace with an expression of calm curiosity that reminded her uncomfortably of the first time she had met Dominic, though none of the warmth that had eventually appeared beneath Dominic's exterior existed here at all. "You must be quite special," Whitfield said, circling her slowly. "Dominic Marchetti does not make mistakes, yet here you are, proof that even he can be distracted enough to leave an opening." "He'll come," Grace said, forcing steadiness into her voice despite the fear coiling tightly in her chest. "And when he does, you'll wish you had never touched me." Whitfield smiled thinly. "That," he said, "is exactly what I am counting on." Hours passed slowly, each one stretching Grace's nerves thinner, though she refused to let her fear show openly, clinging instead to the memory of the calm certainty in Dominic's voice the night he had promised to protect her, whether she stayed near him or not. She held on to that promise now like the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become terrifyingly unstable. Back across the city, Dominic's search finally narrowed toward an old, half-abandoned warehouse near the docks, a property technically owned by a shell company, but long suspected of belonging to Whitfield's operation. Dominic stood outside it in the darkness, every instinct in his body telling him this was the place, though he forced himself to remain outwardly calm, as his men quietly moved into position around the building. "If we go in wrong," Marcus warned quietly, "he could hurt her before we even reach the door." "I know," Dominic said, his jaw tight. "That is why we are not going in wrong." What followed was not the reckless, emotional confrontation Whitfield had clearly hoped to provoke. Instead, Dominic moved with the same careful precision that had kept his organization alive through years of danger, coordinating his men with quiet, controlled instructions, cutting off every possible escape route before making a single move toward the entrance. Inside, Whitfield had grown impatient, waiting for a call that never came confirming Dominic's reckless arrival. He should have recognized the silence as a warning, rather than an opportunity, but arrogance had blinded him to the very real danger closing in around his own operation. When Dominic finally entered the building, it was not with the desperate fury Whitfield had expected. It was with the calm, immovable authority of a man who had spent his entire life learning exactly how to win, without losing control, no matter how high the stakes had become. Whitfield's men, quickly realizing they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered, offered little resistance once they understood the situation had already shifted entirely out of their favor. Whitfield himself attempted to use Grace as leverage until the very last possible moment, only to find Dominic entirely unmoved by threats, his focus fixed solely on ending the standoff as safely and as quickly as possible. "You should have left her alone," Dominic said quietly, his voice carrying a warning far more effective than any raised threat could have been. "She was the only leverage I had against you," Whitfield admitted bitterly, finally realizing how badly he had miscalculated. "She was never leverage," Dominic said. "She is the reason I have anything left worth protecting at all." Within minutes, the situation had been resolved, Whitfield's brief attempt at expansion collapsing as swiftly as it had begun, his own men quickly abandoning any loyalty to a plan that had clearly failed. Dominic moved past all of it without hesitation, crossing the room directly to where Grace sat, quickly freeing her hands and pulling her into an embrace so tight it left no room for doubt about how deeply her safety mattered to him. "You came," Grace whispered, her voice trembling with relief. "I told you I would," Dominic said quietly, his own voice unsteady for the first time since she had known him. I meant it. Grace clung to him, the fear of the past several hours finally breaking loose in quiet, exhausted tears, while Dominic held her carefully, as though afraid that letting go even slightly might allow the danger to return. Around them, his men worked quickly to secure the building. But for a long moment, neither of them paid any attention to anything beyond each other. The drive back across the city passed mostly in silence, Grace resting against Dominic's shoulder, while he kept one arm wrapped protectively around her the entire way. Neither of them spoke about what had happened, or what it meant, though the unspoken understanding between them had shifted into something neither could deny any longer. By the time they arrived back at the quiet house on the edge of the city, exhaustion had settled heavily over both of them, yet Grace found herself unwilling to separate from him even for a moment. She followed him inside without hesitation this time, no longer questioning whether she belonged in this world, but instead recognizing, finally, that some part of her already had decided long before tonight forced the truth into the open. In the days that followed, the city slowly settled back into its usual rhythm, though nothing about Dominic's world ever truly felt ordinary again. Whitfield's failed attempt to expand his influence had cost him nearly everything he had built, his remaining allies quickly distancing themselves the moment word spread of how completely his plan had collapsed. For the first time in years, Dominic's territory stood largely unchallenged, though the peace had come at a price far steeper than territory or money. One of his most loyal men, someone Dominic had trusted since the earliest days of taking over his father's organization, had quietly fed information to Whitfield for months, believing Dominic's growing attachment to Grace had made him too unpredictable to follow safely anymore. The betrayal cut deeper than any external threat ever could have, forcing Dominic to confront uncomfortable truths about loyalty, trust, and the cost of the life he had inherited, without ever truly choosing it. Grace watched him wrestle with this discovery in the days that followed, noticing the exhaustion behind his eyes deepen, even as the immediate danger around them finally began to fade. She found him one evening in his study again, staring at nothing in particular, a glass of untouched whiskey sitting forgotten beside him. "You can't carry all of this alone," Grace said softly, sitting down across from him. "It is what I have always done," Dominic replied quietly. "That doesn't mean it's what you should keep doing." Dominic looked up at her, something raw and tired behind his usually guarded expression. "I do not know how to be anything other than what I have built myself into," he admitted. "I have spent so long protecting this life that I forgot to ask myself whether it was a life worth protecting in the first place. And now?" Grace asked gently. "Now," Dominic said, "I look at everything I nearly lost because of it, and I wonder if there is a version of this life that leaves room for something softer, something worth more than territory or fear." Grace reached across the space between them, taking his hand carefully, grounding him in a way words alone could not manage. "You don't have to figure it all out tonight," she said, "but you don't have to figure it out alone either." Over the following weeks, Dominic began making quiet changes within his organization, changes that surprised even Marcus, who had known him longer than anyone else. He restructured certain operations to reduce unnecessary risk, distanced himself from partnerships built purely on fear rather than genuine loyalty, and slowly began rebuilding trust among the men who remained, choosing transparency where he once would have relied solely on control. None of it happened easily. Old habits proved difficult to unlearn, and there were nights when the weight of his past threatened to pull him back into the colder, more guarded version of himself he had spent years perfecting. Grace remained beside him through those nights, never pretending the darker parts of his world did not exist, but refusing to let him face them entirely alone either. Walter, watching the changes in Grace from a distance, once asked her quietly whether she ever regretted the night she had first stood up to Dominic in the diner, setting everything that followed into motion. Grace considered the question carefully before answering. "There were moments I regretted it," she admitted. "Moments I was terrified of what I had gotten myself into. But I don't think I regret it anymore. Not really. Some things are worth the fear it takes to find them." Walter smiled softly, though concern still lingered behind his eyes. "Just be careful, Grace. Men like him don't change overnight." "I know," Grace said. "I'm not asking him to become someone else entirely. I'm just asking him to let me stand beside the person he actually is, instead of the version everyone else is too afraid to look past." Months passed, and slowly, carefully, Something steady began to grow between them, built not on the desperate urgency of danger, but on quieter moments neither of them had expected to find room for, in lives that once seemed too complicated for anything so simple. Dominic learned to share pieces of himself he had kept hidden for years, and Grace learned to navigate a world she never could have imagined herself part of, without losing the parts of herself that had first caught his attention in that rain-soaked diner. There were still difficult days, moments when Dominic's world demanded decisions Grace did not always agree with, and moments when old rivals tested the boundaries of the peace that now surrounded them. Through all of it, though, neither of them retreated the way they once might have. They faced each challenge together, choosing again and again to stay, rather than allow fear to separate them the way it so easily could have. Years later, on a quiet evening much like the one where everything had first begun, Grace stood at the window of a home that finally felt like it truly belonged to both of them, watching rain fall softly against the glass. Dominic joined her quietly, wrapping his arms around her from behind, resting his chin gently against the top of her head. "Do you ever think about that night?" Grace asked softly. "The diner, the rain." "Every day," Dominic admitted. "It is the night everything I thought I understood about my life stopped making sense." Grace smiled, leaning back against him comfortably. "And now?" "Now," Dominic said quietly. "I understand it perfectly. I just needed someone brave enough, or perhaps stubborn enough, to show me what I had been missing." Grace laughed softly, turning in his arms to face him fully. "Stubborn seems about right." Dominic's expression softened into something few people outside this quiet home ever had the privilege of seeing, something warm and unguarded and entirely real. "Even after everything," he said quietly, "you stayed. Even after everything, you are still the only thing on my mind that has ever truly mattered." Outside, the rain continued falling gently against the city that had once brought them together through fear and danger, though now, standing together in the quiet warmth of a life they had built carefully and deliberately, despite everything working against them, neither Grace nor Dominic feared the storm any longer. They had already weathered the worst of it, together, and found something worth holding on to on the other side.